In this game, you are going to see a deadly duo in action. The queen and the knight. They work so well together. It's the game Fabiano Caruana against Arkadij Naiditsch, played in round 4 of the Grenke chess classic. Caruana, going into this game with 2 out of 3, seems he's not suffering too much of a post-candidate's hangover. At least not so far anyway. He might crash at some point. So Caruana playing the Spanish, and it's a Berlin variation. And instead of going into the endgame, Caruana keeps the tension with d3. So it shows, he's not afraid of a full-blooded fight, because obviously this doesn't allow black to simplify. And here the most popular move in top-level chess is to play bishop c5 to bring the bishop outside the pawn chain. But Naiditsch very quickly played d6. So it's more modest, but of course this just reaches very standard Spanish type positions. And these next moves for white are, well, pretty interchangeable. You could play c3 first. You can also play the knight to d2 if you want, but h3 is fine. So he might be preparing d4, but he just is making sure that there's no bishop g4. And rook e8, very normal move. We've seen this before, of course. And the bishop wants to drop back to f8. So this is all preparing black's centre for a possible advance for white with d4. Now knight d2 is possible, but a4 played by Caruana. So this gains some space on the queen side. The bishop might drop back to c4, but and the knight may now come to a3, but white's setup is very flexible. And bishop f8. And here, yeah, knight a3, knight d2, both possible. But now Fabiano plays bishop g5. So this is a provocative move. We've seen Magnus do this on many occasions. He played it in a similar kind of position against Ho Yifan a couple of rounds ago. It's a provocative move. After h6, so booting the bishop away. Now you might remember that Magnus actually moved the bishop back the other way, but here Fabiano plays bishop h4. There's no blocking a knight coming to g3. So maintaining the pin here, and that tempts black into playing g5, which could be weak later on. Black doesn't have to play g5 here. Bishop e7 is actually a very normal response. I know it looks very strange to play the bishop back and forth, but once the white bishop is committed here, then this is actually a very normal response in Spanish positions. And at some moment you may be able to play knight h5 to trade these bishops. Tactically, if that's not working, then knight h7 also is a possibility. But Naiditsch is a very courageous player, and he really doesn't mind taking risks in a game. So he played g5, most uncompromising move, knocking the bishop back. So the bishop doesn't stand particularly well here. However, this advance, well, there are pros and cons to playing g5 basically. I mean, you might be able to build up an attack with black if white plays inaccurately, but there are big disadvantages, namely the f5 square, which we're going to see later on. Of course, we'd like to follow up with knight h5, but tactically there's a problem. This diagonal, knight takes followed by queen takes. So knight e7. Now this looks very reasonable, to bring the knight to g6 to bolster the king side. And Caruana said afterwards that he was considering playing the bishop back to c4, but he thought he might regret not trading bishops. And I think it's a very sensible decision, because it's all about this square. If white can bring a knight there, then you see the real downside of playing g5. Then black wants to move the pawn back to g6. And the knight prepares a little journey towards f5 with knight d2. Knight g6 played. So at the moment, black's setup looks very nice indeed, but watch out for that f5 square. I've played this kind of system with white on so many occasions, and often one's opponents underestimate how weak this square is, and in fact black's attack doesn't really exist. G4 certainly isn't happening. Now you could just play d4 here. You could play knight f1 too, just with the idea of bouncing around to f5. But Caruana, after almost 20 minutes thought, played knight c4. Now that's risky to invest so much time, but I think in this new situation with the structure changed, then you need time to kind of take in the position, the ins and outs of the new structure. Once again, knight h5, which is a move we'd like to play, and to put the knight here, isn't possible. This is important. So this will be met by knight takes, and once again there's a problem here. G4 certainly isn't going anywhere. That can just be taken, and then you can see that black's structure looks pretty horrible. I mean, certainly white is in absolutely no danger in that position with the bishop here covering the king, and very easy access to the king side for all these pieces actually. Naiditsch played rook d8, so he has another idea in mind. He is breaking with d5. Now you can see Caruana has switched the knight to e3, so black really needs to do something here before white takes control. Already the knight has its eye on f5, and given some time, white may well send this knight back to h2 and into g4, and then you know this queen could come to f3. I mean, this is a lovely position for white. So I think it's absolutely necessary for black to break with d5. But Naiditsch spent over half an hour on d5. Big investment of time, and that's always risky. We've seen from so many games that time pressure plays such an important role in these tournament games. Well, of course, d5 is a break that black wants to make. Put some pressure on e4. But the problem is that actually this gives away a pawn. Of course, Naiditsch realised that. He's looking to break out. If knight takes, this was never his intention, then knight g4 hits e5, but also looks at f6. So, for example, if f6, then that certainly doesn't hold everything together. You kick the knight, and then that's on prise. So after pawn takes pawn, Naiditsch played bishop g7. And now he's threatening to take on d5. So in this way, at least Naiditsch has managed to shake white's control over f5, but he's sacked a pawn. White could hang on to that with c4. I suspect that Naiditsch spent a lot of time looking at this, but then black would open the d file, and you can see this pawn is backward, and certainly black has compensation for the pawn here. Probably white would give up that pawn. But Caruana plays in a very different way. He decides just to break straight away. So this, you may have noticed that in games with a lot of these top players, they don't like to kind of grab material and suffer. They don't like to give the initiative to their opponent. d4 is a very pragmatic move. It breaks out of the position, and Caruana doesn't mind giving back a pawn. So Naiditsch now took on d4. And here, well, white can actually recapture with any of these pieces. It's possible to play like this and put this knight on f5. That's one idea. Queen takes is tempting. But in this case, knight h5 is an interesting possibility. Hitting the queen, and Now this pawn storm starts to look more dangerous because the idea is to lock out this bishop. Now at the moment, well, black gets one of the pawns back, and you can see that this bishop is just locked out of play. I mean, it's still a very double-edged position actually, but certainly decent compensation for black. So again, Caruana plays very pragmatically. He decides just to take back with the pawn. And he took on d5 and some trades here, and bishop takes c7. So he's a pawn up again, and in this position he actually thought that he was going to keep this extra pawn. He said after the game that when he played rook c1 he didn't realise that bishop takes d4 was actually possible, which is funny. I mean, this can be taken, but I don't think white has any real advantage there at all. The knight does a pretty good job of protecting the king, and certainly g5, well, there's no real structural disadvantage there at all. So in this position, after bishop takes d4, material is level, and Caruana invested 10 minutes in this position to try and find a way to keep the game going. And he did manage to find a good continuation. Queen d2. So the queen comes back. So black isn't losing a piece after this. Obviously there's a pin here. Knight takes and rook takes. So the players are trading down into an endgame. And this is where we see queen and knight in action. So the knight has finally managed to get to the dream square f5, just in the black king's face. Threat, knight takes pawn, the king comes to h7 to protect. And now g3. And this was the position that Caruana had foreseen right way back when black took on d4. Objectively, this position is fine for black. You know, if you feed this position into a computer, it will spit out the assessment equals. In practice, and of course Caruana appreciated this, this is actually a difficult position for black to play, because how do you get rid of that knight? And if the queen manages to get in, then this could spell trouble. Naiditsch now had 22 minutes remaining to get to the time control at move 40. So 12 moves in 22 minutes, not serious time pressure at all. But here he invested 16.5 minutes over knight e5. It's not a bad move, but I think this illustrates the dilemma that black is in. You want to play actively. It's nice to activate the knight, but when you do, then the king somehow feels a bit chilly. Queen e3 from Caruana played, now obviously a threat of knight f3, so queen e3 stops that, puts a bit of pressure on the knight, and also looks down at the pawn here. So a few little problems for black to solve. And here, this is a hard move to play, f6, protecting the knight. But it's probably the best move. Why is this a difficult move to play? Well, you don't really want to expose your king along the 7th rank. Nevertheless, it's very hard for white to exploit this. If queen takes pawn, then it's counter-attack time. Queen c6, followed by knight f3. Black should be fine there. But, you know, when you're under pressure of the clock, it's very hard to appreciate this. And f6 feels like a risky move. Instead of that, Naiditsch invested more time, played knight c4, and now he was down to just a couple of minutes. And this is tricky. 11 moves to make for time control at move 40. Very difficult. Queen c3, good move. The problem with moving this knight from g6 is that on g6 it was nice and safe. On c4 it's kind of dangling in the air. But suddenly it feels as though white's threats on the king are more real. So obviously queen g7 mate threatened. Queen e5 played. Now you certainly don't want to trade down here. That's just a draw. Queen d3. There we go. The king is exposed. And in this kind of position, black desperately wants to play the pawn back to g6. Unfortunately, it's against the rules. Here's a nice variation. If queen e1 check and then knight e5, which kind of feels like the thing you want to do to try and get some initiative here against the king and use the queen and knight well. But after queen d5, in fact, the queen is the wrong side of the knight, and it's white that has the initiative here. This is already a very tricky position for black to defend. So Naiditsch careered on with knight takes b2. And I really like this next phase of the game because somehow Caruana, with just a couple of pieces, queen and knight, manages to dominate black's pieces beautifully. Queen steps back, so this knight isn't really escaping. Check from black. And now queen d1. Queen b4 is actually still okay for black because the queen always has the idea to come to e4. So that rather restricts white's queen. It looks like a funny position because obviously the queen is in the same line as black's king, but there is no big discovered check that white has here. It's very curious, but of course when you're short of time it's very difficult to appreciate that. So Naiditsch played queen d1, obviously wanting to trade down. So if queen takes knight, then check and you pick up the knight here. So Caruana played queen e4 very quickly, keeping the pressure on. And this is difficult. If queen d3, then queen e5, and you can see these pieces have just drifted to the other end of the board, and suddenly, bang, it's mate. Or something similar very quickly. Queen d7 was discussed after the game by Caruana, and he felt that white should have something here, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. Well, the computer puts the finger on the right move. King h2, a very subtle move. Black often has queen c6 as a defense, but king h2 is an excellent move. Leaving this knight stranded and just wanting to play queen e5, and this is very difficult for black to defend. Naiditsch actually played queen takes pawn, so he's filling his boots while he can and hoping that he'll have enough to save the game. Queen takes b7, hitting knight, hitting the pawn, but also crucially covering this diagonal so that black's queen isn't able to give a check and get counterplay. And Caruana said that he had foreseen this position with queen takes b7 way back, several moves back, and realized that this was extremely difficult for black to defend, and he's absolutely right. And particularly after this next move, this is absolutely beautiful. Knight e3. Now that's the kind of move, very unexpected move, to face in time pressure. A retreat? A knight retreating? Surely, white's attack isn't going to get anywhere after this move. In fact, it's a brilliant move. It's absolutely brilliant. It restricts this knight. You can see this knight can't come out to c4 because of queen e4 check, winning the knight. It can't come to d3, again queen e4 check, and of course knight d1 is out, that just gets taken. So basically this knight has been dominated by white's knight and white's queen. If knight a4 well, still not a very good square. Then knight d5 cuts off the protection here, and white is getting in that position as well. Well, you might say, okay, the black knight is dominated, but what happens if black just, for example, charges the a-pawn down the board? Okay, well, watch this. It's a slightly slow motion attack, but it's very effective. Check. Beautiful centralization again. I mean, I love this, that white can take his time, keeping the black knight completely dominated. And then once all the pieces are in place, then finally knight f5, and mate follows shortly somewhere along here anyway, depending on how black's king moves. So that's the basic idea. King g7 played, and now Caruana continues this theme of domination. Queen b4, the knight can't move. Queen b1, this queen trying to find its way round, but Caruana just takes his time, so just keeping f5 under control so that he can now move the knight in again. Knight f5, here we go. So now the threats start to be pretty real. White just has to be a little bit careful here. Best not to take pawns up this end of the board, because queen f2 check and knight d3 is threatened, but well, Fabiano had seen this. Check. And once again, the queen returns to b7. It's really funny. Hitting f7, but crucially also keeping an eye on the knight and also keeping an eye on this diagonal. And black has no defense. Here's a very nice variation. Naiditsch actually played king h8 here, but instead, if king g6, we give a check here. If the king retreats, then queen h6, so f6. And now the queen goes back to b7, and mate follows shortly. So instead, king h8 played, and now queen e7. And that was the final move of the game. Threat, well, a check here, and then queen g7. And if black's queen comes back to defend with queen g6, then we give a check and we take the knight, for example, and then you come back and continue the attack. Just love the way Fabiano dominated black's pieces there. Just superb judgment as well, that he knew that even this highly simplified position could lead to trouble for black. Great stuff. Okay, after 4 rounds, we have 3 players leading the tournament, Caruana, Vachier-Lagrave and Vityugov. Carlsen drew today with Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. MVL never really in any trouble at all, just had to hold an endgame quite simply actually. So there we go. If you want to see more playlists, then do check out the info button up here, and also the video description. You'll see, you know, Caruana playlist, Carlsen playlist, and you know all the top players actually. And well, let me know what you think is going to happen at the tournament as well. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.